Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending tonight's event. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Thanks again, everybody, for attending tonight's event. Is this democracy? A virtual webinar put on by the Peoria Democratic Socialists of America, Socialist Alternative Peoria, and the Queer Activists Collective. My name is Doug Johnson. Just to briefly describe some of the things I've been involved in, I am one of the founding members of Peoria DSA, a former co-chair, and most recently I was elected as the delegate to the Democratic National Convention for the Bernie Sanders campaign for president for the Illinois 17th Congressional District in 2020. I am introducing tonight's event and also will be asking your questions to our panelists once we get to the Q&A section at the end of the event. One thing I'd like to point out is you should see a Q&A button on your screen, and that is where you can submit any question you want throughout the event. Please submit any questions you have, even during the presentations. That is fine, because after each presentation, each presenter will be given a couple minutes to respond to a question or two in a more of a brief manner before we move on to the next presentation. And then after our three speakers tonight, we'll have a Q&A section where we'll be able to, I will be asking your questions to our panelists, and you'll be able to get responses on that. So please use that Q&A feature. That is what will make our event tonight as interactive as possible. We want to make sure that your questions are answered to the best of our abilities anyway. So tonight's speakers, we have, once again, we have Peoria DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. We're going to have Ellie, who will be speaking, and we'll have a representative from Socialist Alternative Peoria. That'll be Nick. And we'll also have a representative from Queer Activist Collective, as well as the Western Illinois Democratic Socialists of America. And Emiliano, thank you for being here tonight. And once we get done with our three speakers, that's when we'll go into our Q&A. So once I get done speaking for a couple minutes here, we're also going to have a video. And then at the end, we're going to have another video to play out on after we say our goodbyes. So I just kind of wanted to do a quick rundown with you on how the event's going to go down. And that brings me to why we're here tonight. So all of us witnessed the right-wing attack on the US Capitol to subvert democracy and overturn the presidential election in Donald Trump's favor. We're told growing up, or at least I was told growing up, that the United States, is the freest nation on earth. For me, that meant watching us invade another country for oil, Iraq, despite it being a deeply unpopular sentiment amongst the people of the United States and the entire world, drawing some of the largest protests to date at that time. That also meant watching Wall Street destroy the economy, leading to the world's worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, leaving millions homeless, while our government, under a new progressive president who campaigned on cleaning up Washington and fighting back against special interests, bailed out the banks, and only about 10% of the relief money went to bail out the homeowners during the housing crisis. Once again, I was living in the freest nation on earth, while a small group of people who profiteered off of ruining the economy for everyone else got away scot-free. Once again, there were worldwide protests, some of the largest some of the largest up until that time. So here we are more than a decade past that point. We saw the Electoral College give the presidency to Donald Trump, despite him losing the popular vote by quite a bit. And without having to mention all of the damage and all of the chaos that has transpired since Donald Trump alone, it seems that democracy is an interesting word. Democracy, from what I was always told, was the right to wander into a voting booth every 2 years, check off a box over which politician you hated or disliked the least, and that's why we're the greatest country on earth. Over the last few years, I've come to a completely different kind of politics, a type of politics in which democracy really is at the core of. And that is socialism. I'm a socialist. I'm an anti-capitalist. And the reason why, to put it briefly, is capitalism really is authoritarian in its very nature. And for me, socialism is the cure for that, and that is democracy. And without going into a number of different points and arguments, I would like to, at this point, move us towards our first speaker tonight. Each speaker is talking about a different topic that's related to democracy, socialism, and or capitalism as we currently understand it. So I am going to pull up Ellie Daggett with Peoria DSA. Give me just a second here to figure out these controls. Okay. Go ahead, Ellie.
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm the co-chair of Peoria Democratic Socialists of America. And I'm just going to give a quick little speech here. I'm sure many of you here are already convinced that socialism probably isn't such a bad idea. The discourse is full of references to countries like Canada, Denmark, and Sweden, famous for their robust social programs, worker protections and benefits, universal health care, and well-funded public services. Many of the conversations about Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns made references to such things, and were centered around the idea that doing such things in this, the richest and most powerful country in the world, is common sense and far from radical. There was a man openly and proudly identifying as a socialist running for president of the United States and almost winning the Democratic nomination twice on that platform. Those policies have proven to be extremely popular, and in the countries in which they're the norm, the people tend to be happier, healthier, and wealthier on average. Those things are good. I'm sure most of us are in agreement that all people deserve education, healthcare, access to vital services, paid sick leave, family leave, vacation and maternity leave, and a living wage. And it would seem obvious that the richest and most powerful country in the world could easily pay for them with a simple change in priorities. We have some of these things. We need more of these things, and we absolutely should fight for them. But at the risk of sounding like I'm splitting hairs, that's not socialism. A social safety net is only a bandage, good for stopping the bleeding, but it does not address what caused the wound. Capitalism, the system we currently live under, coerces people to work for someone else's profit with the implied threat of destitution, homelessness, and death that may result from the refusal or inability to participate. This relationship between you, the workers, and those who own and control your workplace and define the terms of your labor, the capitalists, reduces it to a means to an end, something you have to do to stay safe, sheltered, and fed. Social programs are there so that it isn't necessarily the end of the world if you get fired or laid off, quit, can't find a new job, or can't find one that pays well enough to feed your family and pay the bills. But that relationship, that power imbalance between worker and capitalist remains. Workers are the foundation on which the jet-setting lifestyles of the wealthy and powerful are built. It's our labor that pays for their mansions, their yachts, their private jets, and their ability to lobby the government for fewer worker protections so they can become wealthier faster. With every day that passes with the capitalist class increasing its power over the working class, the foundation grows weaker. If something isn't done, the foundation will crumble, and society will come tumbling down when it does. We see the foundation growing weaker before our very eyes. Average wages are stagnating or even decreasing. Workers have less buying power for the same or greater labor than before. House buying jobs became rent paying jobs, became living with family jobs. As a result, people are desperate and angry, but they're not always sure who to be angry at. Some members of the working class turn against other workers, blaming immigrants, minorities, women, LGBT people, or anyone poorer than them for the dire straits we all find ourselves in. All while those who are powerful enough to fix it right now if they wanted to either directly stoke the flames or call for some ill-defined unity, at best ignoring and at worst strengthening the systemic causes for inequality. While a strong social safety net and guaranteed access to basic necessities such as healthcare would help to fill in some of the cracks in that foundation, the stress that caused those cracks in the first place will still be there, and it will only continue to grow as long as we live under a system that funnels wealth and power up to a small handful of people at the top. Welfare is a necessary safety feature under capitalism, but as socialists, we would prefer a system built around maintaining the strength of the foundation first. Socialism is a total departure from the upward flow of wealth and power. Instead, it is built around empowering the working class, the whole working class, which forms the foundation. And by building the foundation stronger, a stronger society can be built on it. It's not simply filling in cracks to prevent it from crumbling under the weight of an inherently imbalanced system. It's a complete alternative to that system, built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Socialism has to be built by the working class. Socialism has to be built by the working class because it is built around the idea that a society should be centered on the needs of all people being fulfilled, based on the ability of those living within it to fulfill those needs collectively. It isn't going to be handed down to us from on high by some kind-hearted politician with a magic wand. That just isn't going to happen because it would go against the ruling class interests of the ever-expanding accumulation of wealth and power by those who already have power. Even the existing social safety net had to be fought for by workers. It didn't just appear out of thin air at the whim of the powerful. It is only by coming together and exercising our collective strength that we could ever possibly build a fair society in which no one will have to work their hands to the bone for scraps. If you want to build that society, please join us and help us build the power of the working class. Help us build a movement of the masses coming together as one to demand an end to exploitation and to shift the burden of holding up society off of our shoulders. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. And thank you very much, Ellie, for that presentation. Does anybody have any quick questions they'd like to submit for Ellie to respond to? Was there anything that Ellie said that you would like to see a response to? And it's okay if you don't have any now. You can always submit it later and we'll be able to get back to it during the Q&A at the end. Okay, all right. So there are no questions at the moment. So that will, actually, a question just popped in. Ellie, would you like to respond to that?
So my turning point that made me turn to socialism.
Real quick, the question is, what was Ellie's turning point that made her turn to socialism?
So it's hard to pick just one moment because it was a whole bunch of things. It started with, I somewhat followed Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign in 2016. I was picking up a lot of what he was putting down. Even though I was still pretty young at that time, I kind of had a sense that this whole capitalism thing wasn't necessarily all that great. From there, I started doing a little more research about, socialism, about what it really means. And I grew more and more sympathetic to it over time, especially as I saw, especially as the contradictions of capitalism became more clear to me over time. And by 2017 or 2018, I joined the DSA, and by then I was a committed socialist.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, Ellie. So we are going to move on to our next presenter from Socialist Alternative. We have Nick Schemmel. And Nick brought up the question, is democracy possible under capitalism?
All right. Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Ellie, for your great contribution. I appreciate the DSA for organizing this call. Big props to them. So, is democracy possible under capitalism? Okay. Since the events of the 6th and developments afterwards, we've heard a lot about this representing a break from the American democratic norms. And that's not incorrect necessarily, but at the same time, those that stormed Capitol Hill on the urgings of President Trump did so under the belief that these norms were violated already and they were restoring American democracy. So while they are indeed few and far between in the face of the total population, a poll from ABC News and Washington Post released on the 15th of this month nonetheless shows that over a third of the country's population doesn't have any faith in the electoral system. So amidst this din of saying democracy was violated on the 6th and those saying it was violated on November 3rd, we should ask ourselves, what is this democracy every side is fighting over? Well, the basics are clear. When a candidate runs on a certain platform for a certain position and we vote for them over another and they implement their platform in the way they see fit, it doesn't quite square away so neatly with reality. I'm going to run down the conflictions on that, how we hear about politics, who implements our politics, and where do we end up, right? First, and this is applicable across all levels, but especially on the federal level, how do we hear about these candidates, right? The most accessible way we hear about these is private media run through corporate entities. And it's no secret that these have political orientations. After all, the two biggest ones that you really hear about in the news are CNN and Fox. And you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who isn't aware that CNN has a bias towards the Democrats and Fox is biased towards the Republicans. And consequently, they represent candidates in a way favorable to that bias. But why does a corporate entity like CNN or Fox have political bias? Among other reasons, they simply have material interests that tether them to presenting a particular side. Their reporting is their product, and consequently, they, by necessity, need to have and maintain a consumer base. And this extends far beyond what side to just show. CNN, for example, is owned by Turner Broadcasting, which is owned by Time Warner, which is owned by AT&T. If a politician ran on the platform to break up massive communication companies like AT&T, would you then trust AT&T to tell you fairly why that person wants to break up communication companies any more than you'd promise or that you'd trust a salesman who promises a car is top shape but won't let you see a mechanic? This might seem to be, small potatoes, but after all, we can all check multiple news sources, but to whom are these multiple news sources accountable? Smaller and much more open sources don't have the capital to disperse information, so even when checking multiple sources, we run the gamut of private interest deciding public news. Further, social media has become the source for many people to hear news, but these sites are also run for profit first. Much like his cabinet, Twitter aided and abetted Trump's platform up until the very moment it would hurt their profit margin to continue to host it. Now, that rightfully done or not, the decision is completely out of the hands of the people. It's not a matter of ideological positioning to say that this already does not give you the fairest footing in a democratic election. Before you even find out the candidates' platforms, there's an entire vetting process on how and how often you hear about them. That's simply from the reporting side. What about the resources these politicians have, like super PACs, private committees used for funneling massive amounts of cash into campaigns and other activities? They're in no way part of a true democracy where people's votes matter. You want to be able to afford large staffs, campaigns, constant travel. Aligning yourself to private interests with a slush fund is a surefire way to do that. Consequently, who gets the most ad time? Who ends up being able to fly to every corner of the country? Who can afford large staffs? Only in rare cases when a politician can garner massive support under the voter base does this play any different. And that's even when they run as cheaply as possible. If capital is what keeps a politician in the game, and capital is what tells you what's going on and why, and what's possible and what the fixes can be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then the decision on who makes it to the voting booth is often out of the hands of the voter entirely. This isn't even touching on the accountability of elected officials, who get much more influence from lobbyists in their next campaign super PAC than the voter back home. After all, it's kind of hard to run any grassroots campaign if it's not favored by either a party or a PAC. So what threat is there in losing a vote when the opposition can't even make it to the booth? It's this situation that we're in. And while there's 1,000 other ways our democratic rights are snipped away at through privatization of infrastructure, services, agencies, purposeful underfunding of legitimate to legitimate cutting entire programs away, getting to the first step of the process has already cast serious doubt into if we can really call this fair democracy. Even when we can vote into office an elected official on the basis that they represent the majority of what we need, what changes need to be in the public's interest, we can't even guarantee we can keep our officials. For example, Seattle Councilwoman and Socialist Alternative Party member Kshama Sawant faces a recall campaign championed by private interests. These charges orientate around her support for BLM protests and her condemnation of police brutality, but they ultimately come from her challenge to corporate control of the city by companies like Amazon. A recall petition against Mayor Jenny Durkan, who supports private interests, were thrown out on the same hand by the same hand that approved the petition against Kshama. If it succeeds, then it sets the stage that, yeah, we might be able to vote in our own interests, but if those interests conflict with big money, it's just a written check away from being thrown out. So as long as the political process is invested with a capitalist economy, we cannot have a true democracy, one where your vote matters and your voice matters. This can only exist when the people we elect are empowered to office, not by financial backing, but by the people. This can only exist when the playing field isn't made by those on the opposing team to your interests. So let's say if you vote for Democrat, would you call it a fair election if the only candidates you could choose from were ones approved by the Republican Party? I wouldn't. We need investment of the people in the process, removal of private interests as a ruling force, and the strengthening of member-led bottom-up organizations like unions to be a fighting force in our society. Without actual representation of the people and these issues that matter to them, we don't have a democracy in the slightest. That's why organizations like our own, like Socialist Alternative, calls for not only the public ownership of these top 500 companies that have an outsized role in our lives, but also for the means that enable people to be invested. Like Doug had mentioned in his introduction, people need to be able to survive. We need free quality education without budget cuts, a living wage, and housing. When we have to fight for our right to exist, how can we even begin to fight for democracy?
Awesome. Thank you very much, Nick. So there is a question that came in through the Q&A, and I think it's appropriate here. Do you think the ruling class is aware of the futility of their upkeep of the status quo in terms of how the status quo is doomed to fail, that is?
I don't think that the status quo is doomed to fail, right? That predicates that we are all involved, that we are all, banded together to fight for what we believe in. Without fighting for what we believe in and without showing that, we can't be silenced and that we, what we believe and what we want as a people matters, then that status quo continues, The ruling class is aware of the situation that they are upkeeping, but there needs to be an actual challenge to that, and that needs to come from actual democratic processes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, Nick, for addressing that question. It's a really important question, right? If taken what our understanding of democracy is it possible under the conditions we're currently in? Okay, so that takes us to our next presenter, and we are going to now move to Emiliano. And Emiliano took on would like to talk about how the pandemic has exacerbated the contradictions of capitalism and how we can fight that as socialists.
Thanks so much. My name is Emiliano, and I am going to be representing the Queer Activist Collective, and then I'm also co-founder of the Western Illinois DSA, as well as several other groups that I participate in. So to frame the current crisis, capitalism is in a stage of crisis even before the pandemic. And we can look at this as a moral crisis, as a political crisis, and as an economic crisis. So as a moral crisis, there's over 40 million people in poverty in the United States, including several million who live on less than $2 a day in cash income. And there's 100 million more in what's termed near poverty, which means they don't have the expenses to cover an immediate emergency of $400. So basically, you're one $400 emergency away from being poor or being in poverty. So that's nearly half the population of the United States. Over half the children in the country are low income. 2/3 in rural schools qualified for free and reduced lunches. In Black and brown neighborhoods, in urban schools, that can be upwards of 90%. And 30 million people without healthcare in the richest country on earth, which is something that the Bernie campaign really, really highlighted. And healthcare costs are the number one cause of bankruptcies in the country, even before the pandemic. Worldwide, the apparently large reductions in overall poverty mask two main facts. First, that the measuring stick for poverty rates were arbitrarily moved in the early 2000s in a way that magically lifted several tens of millions of people out of poverty without actually doing anything other than moving a number around. And then almost all of the poverty reduction in the past 30 years has been in East Asia, specifically China, Vietnam, and Laos, countries that are still nominally communist. And that will be a discussion for another day to talk about how communist they are. But countries that claim to be communist have been responsible for almost every person lived out of poverty in the last 30 years. Or in countries that in Latin America, when they had leftist governments, whether it be Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, or Venezuela. Poverty in the rest of the world, in South Asia, the former Soviet Union, Africa, and conservative countries in Latin America has been increasing. And in terms of a political crisis, we have seen not just the rise of the far right authoritarians in the United States, but across the world. In Latin America's coup government supported by the United States, even under the Obama administration, overthrew democratically elected socialist governments. And then most kind of alarmingly and shockingly to people in the United States now was of course, the election of Trump, but Trump copies across Europe, and especially in the so-called liberated countries of the former Soviet Union, where right-wing nationalist near dictatorships have taken over in Poland, Hungary, and across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The war and political instability that has become a basic fact of life under the American global police state. And these are parts of a structural crisis that are predicated upon a looming environmental collapse. Finally, I'll talk about this a little bit more later. The fact that capitalism is even becoming bad for the majority of businesses, whether they be small or medium-sized businesses, industrial businesses, as the all-consuming power of financial capital specifically is even taking apart existing industries and forcing small businesses into the ranks of the working class by outcompeting them and shutting them down. The pandemic has already caused 400,000 deaths and over 11 million of infections with unknown health effects into the future. And COVID-19 has only intensified the existing contradictions of capitalism. Because basic goods are distributed under capitalism according to the ability to pay rather than according to need, millions of people are about to be evicted and get their utilities shut off. There's a debt crisis, and in a debt-based economy, once one group stops paying, it can cause a snowball effect where nobody can pay their bills. This has been alleviated somewhat by a kind of joke of a stimulus package, which provided $1,200 for an entire year, which many people didn't even qualify for, especially the least well-off anyways. Poor people who didn't file their taxes because they didn't make enough or were dependents, homemakers who are overwhelmingly women and femme people, or immigrants without documentation. 2/3 of the first package went to businesses or the military, and among these businesses, about 80 or 90% went to the wealthiest. And over in the state level in Illinois, after June, there have only been voluntary utility shutoffs, which were only won through tremendous grassroots efforts. However, what's worrying is that this basic model of consumption economy, which has been the assumption for the past 80 years, seems to have disconnected from itself. So even though 2/3 of people reported losing a job or wages in their household and have had serious financial problems, and almost half have had serious problems paying credit card debt, and working people and small and even medium-sized capitalists have lost billions of dollars in wealth. Billionaires have added over $1 trillion to their wealth since the beginning of the pandemic. Zuckerberg nearly doubled his wealth. Elon Musk tripled it. Jeff Bezos added over $60 million. So we should not have to work and put our lives at risk to do unnecessary jobs, but we have no other way of getting the money that we need to survive, so the workers have no other choice. Effectively, this has made the pandemic a genocide against the working class. And I'm going to close real quick. The vaccines that have been developed and rolled out according to the needs and profits of drug companies like Pfizer's have not been developed according to the needs of essential workers and vulnerable populations. Yes. And some immediate things that we can demand as socialists. So the immediate cease to evictions, utilities connections, and cancellations of rent and mortgages, the immediate introduction of universal basic income and universal healthcare, the distribution of basic necessities like food, water, utilities, education and internet, medicine, and healthcare according to need rather than ability to pay, and the public ownership of means of production, especially now the productions of vaccines.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for that. And we see a question that popped in for you. How much pressure do you believe would be necessary for the federal government to adequately compensate and support the American populace? So let's say I would imagine doing a number of the things that you just mentioned.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of pressure, and I think right now we do not have the organization, the working class organizations in place to exact that pressure, because we can't win these things as individual workers because we individually do not have the power to do that. We need working class organizations. The good news is that we individually can go out building working class organizations by reaching out to our co-workers, by reaching out to our fellow tenants. But we have to do that work and build them because we can be mad, we can fight back, but unless we have some types of organizations to stick up for us so that we're all not having to constantly do the work all of the time, some permanent organizations, then they can just wait us out. and they don't care if we die. We've already seen during the pandemic, the economy has tremendous capacity to absorb the loss of basically we are unproductive consumers, and we don't count in capitalist society. So we're not going to win just by asking nicely. We're going to have to fight for it, and we have to organize first. And we can take whatever we're organized to win.
Awesome. That was a great answer. I love that. Okay. So we have had the opportunity to listen to a few different speakers here, and all of them tried to address kind of a different topic. So Ellie talked about America already being kind of socialist. Well, no, it's not. Nick talked about democracy being possible under capitalism. And we had just heard Emiliano talk about the pandemic and how it has kind of exacerbated these contradictions in capitalism and some things that we can demand as socialists to kind of try to get out of it. So what we're going to do next is we're going to play a little video here about capitalism and poverty. It's a really great video. It's about 6 minutes long. So we're going to go ahead and pull this up. And then when we're done with the video, we're going to come back for an open Q&A so we can have a little bit more of a back and forth and answer more of your questions. So if you have any questions whatsoever, whether it's about socialism, about what's going on right now, any questions about how democracy relates to socialism, anything like that, please submit them, and then we'll use that during the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and transition over here to the video.
Here's something you hear a lot. Say what you will about capitalism, you can't deny it's lifted people out of poverty. I hear that all the time, especially when I'm talking about rising inequality and the vanishing middle class. The rates of extreme poverty, we are told, have plummeted under global capitalism. We are told that global capitalism has cut poverty by as much as 80 or 90%. This reminds me of my mother. Whenever I ranted about how bad the situation was today, she would tell me how much worse it had been before. Be grateful for the improvements, Richard, she would say. I wasn't convinced then, and I'm not now. These champions of capitalism are slick, I'll give them that, but here's why they're wrong. Their clever math comes from how they define poverty. According to the World Bank, anyone making under $1.90 a day is considered poor. Everyone else is okay. But that number isn't actually based on the living costs of any actual person. It's totally arbitrary. Could you live on $1.90 a day? The United Nations doesn't think so. They say everyone would need at least 4 times that, $7.40 a day, to get the absolute minimum for, quote, basic nutrition and normal human life expectancy, end quote. Using this more realistic number, the number of people in poverty has actually increased over the last 4 decades to a whopping 4.2 billion. Poverty has gone up, not down. But hey, at least a proportion of people in poverty has gone down, they might say. But what's actually the reason for that? Was it really capitalism that was our knight in shining armor? As a matter of fact, almost all of that reduction in poverty has been in one country, China, not in the countries where American-style capitalism was exported. China accomplished this with massive government industrial spending and social programs that it calls socialist. With a few exceptions, the rest of the world has seen very little progress in reducing poverty. If you exclude China, then not only has the number of people in poverty increased, but the proportion of people in poverty hasn't fared much better, ticking down a measly 5.4% over 40 years. At that rate, experts project it would take more than 200 years to come close to eliminating poverty. And that's only if there are never any recessions and the global economy manages to reach 173 times its current size. No one expects either of those things to happen. Already, the crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic has made years' worth of poverty reduction worthless. 100 million people have fallen right back into extreme poverty. But the problem isn't the viruses. Viruses come and go. The real problem is the system, a system that implodes every 4 to 7 years, pushing more and more people into deep poverty, and which has absolutely no protections for ordinary people when it collapses. Even the defenders of the system have started to admit just how flawed it is. The World Bank itself now says that reducing inequality by just 1% a year would lift more people out of poverty than increasing economic growth by 1% above current forecasts. That's not to say some things haven't gotten better, but where they are, it's because of ambitious government programs. That's why Cuba, an avowedly socialist country under a decades-long embargo, has a lower rate of infant mortality, a higher life expectancy, and a higher rate of literacy than the much wealthier United States. And that's also why the countries with the lowest poverty are places like Denmark and Finland. It's no mystery. No advanced economy has ever achieved low poverty rates without high levels of government social spending. And the fact is, capitalists have always fought against those policies, against progressive taxation, against minimum wages, against social welfare programs, against union bargaining. Poverty has been reduced not by capitalism, but in spite of and against capitalists' opposition. So it's not just that capitalism doesn't fix poverty. It plunges more and more people into desperation so that the system can survive. The rising number of people in poverty can attest to that. And despite what the inaccurate statistics might suggest, as long as we have a system designed around profit, that won't change. This is Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics at the New School University for the Gravel Institute.
Okay, and we are back. Fun little video there. That one got me. All right, so that brings us to the next section of our event tonight, which is our panel / Q&A. So let us go here to the questions. And we'll go ahead and if you want to answer this one, go ahead and just speak up, but I'm going to ask the question. So what would be some of the first steps besides mass mobilization to achieving this goal?
I can answer this one. This goal, presuming that means actual proper democracy. After all, this webinar is this democracy? Mass mobilization is the main thing, right? So those other first steps would be orientating around trying to achieve that, and that's things like making that process accessible. Like I said in my lead off, it's hard to ever, be invested in politics when you're just fighting for your right to exist. So making sure that people have access to, when voting, we all hear these horror stories about mile-long lines just to the one voting booth in the county, or not being able to vote because you're on third shift or you work too many jobs. I mean, how are you supposed to be involved if you're working 3 jobs just to make ends meet? And that's not even for, a large family, in a lot of cases. So that's things like a minimum wage. That's things like rent control, stop people from being gouged. That's things like being able to be informed and be informed fairly. There's 1,000 other things, but unfortunately, the way that we get this is through mass mobilization, first and foremost. The empowerment of the working class, such as myself, such as, the majority of the people here. So.
And just to kind of bounce off of that a little bit, Nick. So do you see a difference between like mass mobilization and then like organization?
I think they are hand in hand, right? You need to have organization of people who are more directly involved. Of course, I don't think they should play, this leading role. I'm not going to make the case that we need some sort of, intermediary for democracy. That again wouldn't be democracy, right? But organizing to get to that point is an essential part of making sure that we have the structure to enable these people. And the vital process of that is what we're doing here, what the DSA does, what SA does, what QAC does, is making sure that there's a structure in which these voices can be heard through in lieu of any other one that's missing.
Okay, awesome. Okay, let's see. Here we go to the next question. What is the difference between socialism and communism? Here's a good one.
I can try to answer that one. So that's one of those questions where if you ask 10 people, you'll get 100 different answers, right? But personally, communism, at least as defined by Karl Marx, which is the definition that I'm going to be going with, is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. So then socialism would be the transition from capitalism to communism.
Got it. So communism's more of kind of like the peak of our idealism, the goal that we like, or not we in particular, because people identify in different ways, but of communists. I'm a communist, so that's why I say we. So the goal of that is the goal of communists, but then that socialism is the vehicle to achieving that goal.
Yeah.
Okay. So it can be a little hard to distinguish, right? Like when someone says they're a socialist, is that different from someone who says they're a communist? How does that work?
And yeah, that's the thing. Ask 10 people, get 100 different answers, right? I mean, some people identifying as socialists might really be communists, and maybe they don't even know it. They want this end goal of a stateless, classless, moneyless society. But then there might be other people who just want, for example, social democracy, such as they have in like the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. And I mean, I would say that person isn't really a socialist. They just want capitalism to have airbags.
Sure.
But,
Sure. Okay. Awesome. Let's see. Next question. How does Peoria DSA or Queer Activist Collective or Socialist Alternative build democracy into its organizing. And actually, if it's okay, I think I might step in and respond to this one, at least as far as Peoria DSA goes, because I've been involved for a while and was part of forming some of those things. So democracy really into its organizing, it's a really important thing. How can we go about achieving a democratic society if we are not producing democracy in the institutions that we believe are the vehicles for achieving democracy, right? So we have to practice those from the very, very, very beginning. And at least as far as DSA goes, we have, and we focus very much on democratic processes for decision making. And without going into the weeds on like the very specifics of that, we take that very seriously. If you come to a DSA regular meeting sometimes, and like let's say it's your first meeting, it could be a little confusing at first because you might first see kind of how slow things go when it comes to making a decision sometimes. Other times it's very quick, but you may also see that there's this like kind of focus on like what the procedures are, because we believe in a set of fair rules for decision making, right? And that means in our meetings, having a systemic system of decision making that does not allow any one person to dominate the meeting or to dominate the decision making or anything like that. So, and you can get into a lot of different systems for decision making and the pros and cons of them, and would love to have that debate with you sometime. But it is very important to us that our membership has democratic rights in our organization, and that every member knows about those democratic rights, and those are in our bylaws, which are available. And the nice thing about these rights is you can use them to change them. So everything ends up typically always going back to a chapter vote on decision making. And there's all kinds of different ways to accomplish this or that, depending on if there's a meeting coming up or not. So yeah, I mean, it's really important that we do build that into our organizing. And the idea is that when a member participates in a meeting and participates in that decision making, that they see that their participation was worth something, that it was meaningful, that it's not just jumping onto a Zoom meeting of the many types of Zoom meetings we're all used to having by now, right? And it's just like 2 or 3 people like kind of dominating and arguing back and forth while everybody watches, right? And these are hard things to do because it's uncomfortable. Having any kind of control or fair rules in the decisions that we make on our day-to-day typically doesn't exist. When we wake up in the morning, we know what we're supposed to wear, and that was determined by our employer. We know when we wake up in the morning how much free time we're going to have that day. And we know that that was determined by our employer. We know that our healthcare options were determined by our employer. We know what we can say on social media is determined by our employers. Our other job opportunity. Anyway, I can go on forever. So it's really uncomfortable having practicing democracy, but it's something that we're really going to have to focus on every single step of the way, built from the bottom all the way to the top, if we have any hope to accomplishing these goals.
And I can answer that for the SA portion as well, since this is opposed to through organizations. Without getting into the minutia of it, I think pretty simplistically, we build democracy into our organizing by making sure that every one of our members is involved, and then also by making sure that the people that we reach out to are involved. One thing in particular, beyond just making sure that everybody contributes if they can, everybody has the chance to contribute in a meeting. Everybody's aware of the meeting and is encouraged to do so, and how we help build our membership as we try to build the working class and build fighting mass movement is, very dear to us, is this, anti-harassment policy. Because that is something that happens no matter what type of organization you're building. And we need to make sure that people from every walk of life, every type of identity is represented, because that is what comprises our society. And that's what ultimately comprises a democracy, what comprises the people. So that's one very important personal way, I think. Yes, like Marissa said in the chat to all the attendees, creating the space where people have a chance to participate and they have the avenue to do so is crucial. And that's really what SA really strives for.
All right. Well, that's a pretty good discussion on that topic. Let's move on to the next question. Here's a great one. How does socialism remedy cultural issues which exacerbate the flaws of capitalism, such as discrimination based on race and sexuality?
I'd like to take that one. So for another call that I'm dual screening on, actually, we were just reading a passage from one of Che Guevara's books about how humans, we grow slowly, and we don't always necessarily develop with the material conditions around us. Marxists consider the society to develop based on the relationships, the economic relationships in society, and from those come kind of the cultural relationships. But we don't, just because like a factory or employment structure changes doesn't mean that the people who grew up under an old social system immediately change. But we do know that if we don't change the economic system, then those people won't change. And so one of my favorite quotes from Marx is that under capitalism, everything that was holy is profaned, everything that was solid melts into air. That there is going to occur social change even under capitalism. What socialism does is provides the basis for the material change that makes those old prejudices socially unuseful. And then after the material basis for those social prejudices are eliminated, then that allows people to do the work both through societal education as well as personal development to get rid of homophobia and racism and misogyny. And if we look at the historical socialist revolutions throughout the world, especially gender equality was one of the most central issues of those revolutions. And in any socialist country that we look at, whether it be China or the Soviet Union or Cuba, the things that were done for women's equality and women's rights were things that were not surpassed in the Western world really until the feminist revolutions of the 60s and 70s. And in some cases, in places where communism was overthrown, there was immediate repercussions for the rights of women.
Thank you. And so to kind of try to tie some of the things you were saying down to kind of maybe like a real world example. Tell me if this makes sense to you. So, for instance, like the nativist calls against immigration that we see from like Donald Trump and a lot of these like white supremacist groups and things like that. When you say those like old prejudices wouldn't be useful, so like in a scenario where employers weren't allowed to exploit immigrant labor more than they do any other workers' labor, right? If they weren't allowed to do that in the first place, then maybe the whole "they took your job" thing that they do to turn, white workers against immigrant workers, and they also use that to turn black workers against immigrant workers. There wouldn't really be any fuel to the fire. That's kind of like what you're saying there, right? Right. And so like even going back to the example of like Reagan and welfare queens in the 80s, right? That was a specifically racially targeted attack that went all around everywhere. It was a ploy to cut down the welfare state, right? But as long as they could convince the center majority of white people that, oh, it's the other that's the problem, right? Well, then they'll support cutting down that welfare system, right? So that's kind of along the lines of what you're saying.
Yeah, and also historically, if we look as well, the socialist movement has always been intentionally international and intentionally anti-racist. Like in 1920, in the middle of the Civil War in Russia, the communists organized really one of the first international conferences for the people of Asia and the Middle East that focused on like their wants and their aspirations and their needs in their countries as well, and sent out like trained revolutionaries throughout Africa and Asia and the Middle East after that as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for responding to that. Okay, so we've answered all of the questions so far. Is there anything else any of our panelists would like to say before we close out?
If by chance any of you have been swayed to socialism, please join an org.
Cannot reiterate that enough. And I do want to say thank you to all the panelists for your great contributions, and reiterate thank you to the DSA for hosting this event.
And capitalism is not inevitable, and the horrors that we see every day because of it are not inevitable. As Ursula Le Guin said, the divine right of kings at one point seemed like it was just the natural order of things, and just like right now capitalism seems like it is the natural order of things. It's not, and it doesn't have to be. There was a time before capitalism and there will be a time after capitalism, but we have to organize and we have to fight for it.
Awesome. And Ellie, if people were interested in Peoria DSA, where can they reach out?
You can check out our website, peoriadsa.org. There are links to join there. Or you can send us an email at peoriadsa@gmail.com.
And Nick, if people wanted to reach out to Socialist Alternative Peoria?
Yeah, so for Peoria, if you want to see what we're doing, you can go to our Facebook page or Instagram for Socialist Alternative-Peoria. And if you're thinking about joining or you want to learn more about Socialist Alternative, just go to socialistalternative.com and go to the Contact Join Us page, and you'll be in touch. We also have an event this Saturday at 6 p.m. to build a mass movement to stop the far right, if you're interested in seeing one of our events. So I'll post the link to that in the chat.
And Emiliano, for Queer Activist Collective?
Yeah, you can look up Queer Activist Collective on Instagram or Facebook. You can search at QAC_IL. I can, if we are on for a little bit more, find the link and post it in the chat as well. Yeah, and Queer Activist Collective is more of a network of activists, and yeah, we can plug you in with us or plug you in with other activists and socialist organizations, and anarchists too. Gotta love the anarchists.
Yes, solidarity. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that. And yeah, we will be on for a few more minutes here. So what we're going to do, we're going to say goodbye here. And then after that, we're going to play out on a video. So that video will be a video about Martin Luther King Jr. We thought it would be obviously a good time to play out on that. And before we do that, I'd like to thank everybody once again for coming to our event here tonight, giving us the opportunity to answer your questions, giving us the opportunity to talk about democracy, socialism a little bit. You know, I think we all could talk for a very long time about these topics. So please reach out to any of those organizations. And let's see, another shout out we got to do. And I can't forget this. So also reach out to Peoria Mutual Aid. If you have any, if you are in support of working class people taking care of each other and not having to rely on the state or the government that won't address our needs right now, well, that is great, because there is a group of people that are doing good things for people, and you could help them out a little bit. So definitely check out Peoria Mutual Aid. There will be some links to that in the chat as well. And yeah, once again, thanks everybody for coming. We're gonna play out on this video, so feel free to stay and watch this video. Once it's finished, we'll be closing down the meeting.
Dr. King was a democratic socialist who was committed to radical racial justice. We have to stop lying to ourselves. We have to stop picking his bones clean and confront what he actually called us to be. When we celebrate Dr. King, we think about the Montgomery bus boycott, and we tell that story from the bus boycott to the I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington. And it's part of a standard story we tell ourselves about the Black freedom struggle, that it's accepted by mainstream society. It's a story that it begins in the 20th century with the founding of the NAACP. And then we jump from the NAACP all the way to Brown v. Board of Education, and then the Montgomery bus boycott, and then the student sit-ins, and then the March on Washington, and then Selma, and then King's murder. It fixes Dr. King in one place because he's palatable there, because he's talking about love. By the time King is murdered, he's still talking about love. He was a preacher after all. But he's speaking to the three evils: the peril of militarism, the effects of capitalism, and of course, the ongoing sin of racism. Dr. King was also engaged in a radical politics because he understood that radical change was necessary if the country was actually going to be saved. There's this sense in which Dr. King has always invoked the Dr. King of 1963, the Dr. King of 62, 61, the Dr. King of the Montgomery bus boycott, in order to constrain the scope and extent of our politics. But when we talk about Dr. King of 68, when he's talking about a fundamental reordering of our economic reality, when he's thinking about and trying to organize a poor people's campaign, where he's going to bring poor people from around the country, Black people, brown people, white people from around the country, to build a tent city in Washington, D.C., to bring to the fore the situation, the circumstance of poor people around the country. That's not the Dr. King of I Have a Dream. That's the Dr. King who understood that we needed a radical act of civil disobedience to jar the conscience of the nation. Remember, by the time he was shot down, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was calling for a fundamental reordering of America's economic system. He understood that racial justice was tied to economic justice. Right? He understood that a system, an economic system, which presupposed that there was disposable people, could only produce a society that was predicated upon evil. And so he challenged the very assumptions of the country. And he did so from a moral standpoint. And for some, that was not only radical, for some in the government, he was the most dangerous human being in the country. King, in some ways, passed from being a kind of radical figure in American history to being a corroborator of America's promise. King became not the figure who challenged us to live up to the principles of the revolution. King became an affirmer of those principles, a kind of voice that in some ways celebrated the greatness of America. So he crossed over and became, in the symbology of the country, a figure consistent with Washington and Jefferson and the like. His voice, in other words, was co-opted as a part of a story of American exceptionalism, an affirmation of the greatness of America as opposed to a critical voice speaking to the contradictions at the heart of the country. Dr. King would not be satisfied with the moderates of today. Dr. King would be highly critical of folk who are satisfied with the current order of things, or folk who are willing to bite their tongue in the face of the nastiness and ugliness of a person like Donald Trump. I think if Dr. King were to be here in this moment, he would see a continuation of the forces that he confronted in the last days of his life.